This will be a foreign policy achievement on par with bringing down the Soviet Union. It's worth the effort.
Today is Monday, March 9th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. We're now more than a week into the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and by most military measures, the campaign is going well. In the opening hours of the operation, dozens of Iran's top political and military leaders were killed in strikes that demonstrated remarkable intelligence capabilities. Since then, Iran's missile stockpiles, launchers, and production facilities have been steadily degraded. Other key elements of Iran's military, including its nuclear facilities and naval forces, have also been set back years. Now, none of this means the war has been painless. The fighting has so far claimed the lives of 6 members of the United States Armed Forces and a dozen people in Israel. And yet, Israeli public opinion remains strongly supportive of the campaign. But if you're following the public conversation, you might assume a very different story. Listening to most media outlets and pundits, you find the war being morally condemned and described as a looming regional catastrophe, an escalation that will engulf the Middle East, destabilize global markets, and drag the United States into another endless conflict. In other words, alongside the military battle is a war of narratives. And there's no one better equipped to explain the war of narratives than my guest today, Dr. Einat Wilf. She's a former member of the Israeli Knesset and one of the sharpest analysts of Israel and the Middle East. Let's get into it. Dr. Einat Wilf, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
We have to talk about a lot of things. There is a major narrative war underway. There's the real war in the Middle East, but then there's everything that's playing out in the media, in political circles, amongst the pundit class, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I wonder if we can start with me sharing with you an excerpt from an editorial written by the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. They wrote, 5 days into the war, you'd think from the coverage and commentary that the United States is losing. Financial markets are said to be in turmoil. The war is engulfing the region and maybe the world. The United States is running out of missiles. The war is a gift to Russia, and there's no plan for how this ends. And these are just a few of the dire media themes. Judging from the Beltway panic, you'd think America is destined for defeat and deserves it. Rarely have so many seemed so eager to predict American humiliation. Einat, why do you think there's so much commentary that has framed this war in such bleak terms?
I think the correct phrase in what you discussed is Beltway panic, but I would argue that the Beltway panic comes from the, I would say, distinct possibility that this might go well. It essentially throws decades of received orthodoxy about how to deal with Iran, how to deal with threats, the limits of American power, how to deal with Israel, what the people of Iran want. So I agree there is a panic, but it's very much the panic, I think, of a certain intellectual policy class that this might actually succeed.
So according to the INSS, 81% of the Israeli public supports the attack, and 63% of Israelis believe the campaign should continue until the Iranian regime is toppled. Now, that seems to me like a very nationalistic Israeli response, but we're not really seeing the same thing in the United States. There was a CBS poll that was done, and it found that fewer than half of Americans actually support the war, mostly because they're confused about what the war's aims are. They feel that the president hasn't adequately made the case, and many of them want to see him go to Congress in order to get approval to continue the war.
So first on the Israeli perspective. The Israeli perspective is, I will argue, finally logical in the sense that the only goal that ever made sense with respect to Iran, it was always an ambitious goal, but it was the only goal that ever made sense, was for the Islamic Republic to come to an end. As with the ideology of Palestinianism, as with other enemies, the issue is not just the weapons they hold. The issue is ultimately what is the ideology for which they hold these weapons. That kind of makes the biggest difference, right? It makes a big difference whether, nuclear weapons are held by France or they're held by Iran. even though now there's a joke that the Islamic Republic of Britain will be the first kind of major nuclear power. But okay, the question is, what is the ideology for which various weapons are to be deployed? And I think it was always true that the only truly long-term effective way to ensure that Israel is not under threat by the Islamic Republic of Iran is to ensure that there's no Islamic Republic, only Iran. Now, the Israeli kind of threat perception is obviously very different from the American one. So that would create a structural difference. Israelis have logically and understandably a very different understanding of what the threat is posed to them by the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're experiencing that threat in real time. And the United States, obviously, that is the benefit of being America, kind of living in a wide continent, separated from the world by two oceans, with Canada as your northern neighbor. And this is, by the way, the structural issue that always impacted American attitudes to war. Because by definition, America doesn't feel the threat of war around the world as much as the threat from other kind of powers around the world as in Israel does.
And even more than that, they feel the pain at the gas pump. They feel the economic pain, but not the security pain.
Yes, even though, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine increased prices, and it didn't lead to a kind of massive rallying for the United States to support Ukraine. So I think generally it is understood Americans on the mainland will always be structurally averse to war. People forget how averse Americans were to going into World War II. People pretend as if America always knew that it was going to save the world. But no, it was incredibly reluctant to do so. And if Nazi Germany had not joined Imperial Japan in declaring war on the United States, who knows how things might have turned out. There's also, of course, the question of trauma. And we know it, that generally to guide your life based on trauma is not a good idea. And America right now operates on a policy level based on the trauma of Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is, I think, why perhaps the American president is sometimes not clear. I think the goal is very clear, but maybe to the American public, whether the goal is really regime change. And there is this fear that this is going to be another forever war. All that people hear is Middle East, regime change, and immediately goes back to Iraq and Afghanistan. And also the sense of like that, some of the, especially when it came to Iraq, that the reasons to go to war were essentially not the real ones. So all of these things play into it. It's important for me to say, Iran is incredibly different on several levels. There used to be a joke that if you want to have an avowed capitalist, make sure that they live in the Soviet Union. And you're actually getting the opposite now. You're getting avowed socialists because they live in capitalist countries.
That would be the mayor of New York City.
Exactly. But if you want, the same thing goes for the people of Iran. If you want to have a modern, secular, pro-American Western society in the Middle East, make sure that they spent nearly half a century under an Islamic republic. Because the people of Iran are actually pro-American, pro-West, a large share of them. They are very likely to have a secular country once the Islamic Republic is gone. They're certainly not likely to be enamored by any notion of Islamic revolution. And also, they have a lot of the textbook elements. I studied transitions to democracy. They have a lot of the elements that actually make for successful transitions to democracy, which Afghanistan and Iraq never had. They have a coherent sense of history and culture and nationality. They are a highly educated public. They have a strong, if strained, middle class. They have actually the practice, even if very limited, of parliament, deliberation, elections. They don't have a young population. That actually matters, that they don't have this youth bulge. So they actually have a lot of the elements that make for successful transition to democracy. So if anything actually drew the United States into this war, I would blame the people of Iran. What does it mean? Is when the people of Iran went to the streets, demonstrating remarkable courage, calling for freedom, calling for essentially the Shah to come, not as a king, but really as a figurehead to what can be a democracy under a constitutional monarchy. This finally raised the prospect that the United States can bring Iran to the pro-American, pro-Western kind of orbit, and do it without boots on the ground, because the boots on the ground will actually be the courageous people of Iran. And I think a lot of people, including President Obama himself, have pointed to the Green Revolution as a moment of massive American failure, when so many courageous Iranians, once more, went to the streets following on the promise of the American president in his Cairo speech, and they were betrayed. And I think President Trump was determined not to repeat that mistake. And in that sense, I think the American involvement, the American attacks this time are very much done because the people of Iran showed that there is a way for so-called regime change. I will call it a real democratic transition that America could achieve without getting involved in the way that was Iraq and Afghanistan.
You make a good point, which I like to raise also, which is that President Trump has not departed from previous administrations' foreign policy. This promise that American presidents have made, that Iran cannot be a nuclear power, that it cannot be a threat to the United States, has been made by every president since President Clinton. So you've got Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, and now Trump, and he's the first one to act on it. But the play of American politics has certainly affected Israel's relationship with Congress and the American public. You expect certain statements and vitriol and rhetoric from people like the Squad, from the Rashida Tlaibs and the Ilhan Omars. But now you have people like California Governor Gavin Newsom, and he's a Democrat who is widely seen as a very likely presidential candidate. He comes out and suggests the United States should reconsider its military support for Israel, and he compares Israel to an apartheid state.
Two elements on that. As you spoke, and you spoke about the fact that America had a longstanding commitment that President Trump was the first to act on, it actually reminded me of a similar policy issue, which is moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, which was also a longstanding American and even congressional commitment. And the American president was the first to act on it. And at the time also, you had this Beltway panic and everyone saying that this will instigate war. And of course, it actually was a key policy brick that helped bring the Abraham Accords. It was one of the very important policies of the first Trump administration that helped make it clear and kind of cleared the path to the Abraham Accords by making it clear that the United States is basically sending the message of enough is enough. And we're putting an end to all kinds of bizarre policies, such as not moving the embassy to Jerusalem. So that's actually also a great parallel. When I teach people about politics, I always tell people that politicians are very simple creatures. Politicians, you know, I'm one too, we are simple creatures. We respond to incentives. So actually, if you're seeing Newsom say what he's saying, what you should ask yourself, what are the incentives that lead him to believe that if he's going to say those things, this is how he will become the candidate?
The election of Zoran Mamdani as a socialist becoming the mayor and the head of the most capitalist city in the world. That's exactly what taught him that it works.
Exactly. So he saw that it works. He's getting those incentives kind of message to him. So he thinks to himself, okay, this is how I get the Democratic nomination. So for me, what's worrying is not him individually, it's the fact that he reflects what we've known now for a while is that the incentive structure, certainly in the Democratic Party, has shifted, and certainly in a primary situation where you have the more committed members of the party, has definitely shifted to an anti-Zionist position. And that is a trend that we've seen for a while. We see it reflected in numbers. It is, of course, deeply distressing. And I think that Israel is beginning to prepare for it. So we're seeing it in a few ways. First of all, to begin to prepare for no longer getting United States essentially subsidies for the American industry that go to Israel.
Meaning the United States gives Israel military aid, but Israel is required to spend that military aid on American manufacturing.
Yes, thank you for clarifying it. That was important. And I think it's a good thing that the Israeli prime minister said that he wants to have a plan to phase it out. And to exchange it for other elements that are more befitting, which is what we're seeing now, a real ally. And as the Secretary of War said, a capable ally, one that is capable also of having its own manufacturing, one that is no longer poor. In many ways, we're actually seeing, it's quite remarkable to see the exchange of Israel and Britain as the number two ally in war, right? It's insane. We talk about the North Atlantic and the treaty, and Britain always as kind of understood to be the number two ally. Now we're seeing it in real time.
The sun has very much set on the British Empire. There's no question about that.
Yes, and you're seeing in real time, compared to the first Gulf War, where Israeli pilots, I had a friend at the time who was an Israeli pilot. And at the time, because the United States wanted the Arab countries to be its allies in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that it knew that bringing Israel in would make it impossible for the Arabs to ally with the United States, that Israel was actually forced to not respond to the missile barrage that came from Iraq into Israel. And I had a friend at the time who was an Air Force pilot, and you cannot think of a bigger difference. Every morning, he went to the cockpit, he sat inside, I think at the time it was an F-4 or an F-15, I don't remember, and he sat there for several hours, and then he had to leave the plane, and that's it. Like, Israeli Air Force pilots sat on the ground, in the planes, essentially told by the United States, don't dare take action and don't dare respond. And that was, 91? And now Israel is essentially playing the role of Britain as the kind of the next in line capable ally. You're seeing CENTCOM saying tweets like the two strongest air forces in the world. What I think is smart is really for Israel to build a relationship with the United States, both financially, both in terms of joint cooperation, industrial production that should also be in Israel, in a way that reflects Israel's new role as the number two ally, the capable ally. You know, the Secretary of War's speech was hilarious because it reminded me of a parent who's saying really good words, like a lot of compliments to their more successful child, but they're saying it really loudly so that like the less successful kid will hear all those compliments and maybe change their ways. So the Secretary of War kept on giving all these compliments to Israel of being a capable ally, and then in a way to address the very feeble former Western European allies, he kind of spoke of Israeli capabilities being a breath of fresh air, and essentially kind of a dig at the Western Europeans that if you're not capable allies, what kind of allies are you?
What's worse than that, I'm watching European leaders, but also, let's say, Canada, coming out and condemning the war, condemning President Trump. These are countries that benefit from the military protection that the United States provides. These are people that are benefiting from America going after the world's most threatening terror-sponsoring regime. And it's one thing to not support the war. It's another thing to actually go and speak out against it. But I want to pivot us back to this question of the political landscape in the future. I asked you about the Democratic Party, but the criticism isn't only coming from the left. You have prominent conservative commentators like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Megyn Kelly that have devoted significant attention, I would say weirdly obsessive attention, to criticizing Israel. Why do you think these voices have become so central and so prominent?
Okay, so first, let's clarify, and you know that they're not criticizing Israel, right? Like you said, they're engaging in bizarre conspiracy theories. They're not criticizing Israel. As my colleague, Dr. Shani Moore says, when you're criticizing, there must be something you're actually critical of. And, there must be something that you can say that needs to change, but that's not what they're engaging.
They're deep into conspiracy theories. They're going after Chabad. Candace Owens went on her show and called Jews filthy. Disgusting, yeah.
Exactly. So these are full-on conspiracy theories. And you're absolutely right. People have remarked on their rise within the right, the Republican Party, and also the fact that this is also creating an incentive structure. And we'll have to see that will it ultimately mean that a kind of a J.D. Vance character that tends to respond to those incentives, or is it going to be more like a Marco Rubio, Peter Hegseth kind of that tend to still respond to the traditional evangelical, kind of traditional conservative base of the Republican Party? But you're absolutely right. Israel, as much as right now we seem to be enjoying a very strong allyship and cooperation, and it does matter the more that Israel becomes integrated in numerous levels throughout kind of the United States in terms of being an ally. It's not something that you can just kind of turn on a dime when there's a different administration. But it's true that Israel also needs to prepare for, a scenario that used to be considered crazy, but not so much, of a kind of an AOC type Newsom Democratic Party, a J.D. Vance Republican Party, and to prepare for that. And I think this American president is precisely the moment for Israel to make sure that it can secure, again, that a very different level of what it means to be an ally, and transition away from the traditional American financial support, to ensure that Israel has much more of its industrial base in Israel, the military industrial base in Israel as well. We had, as you know, a very important visit by the Prime Minister of India on the eve of this war. And this was in many ways to see a future born. So an Israel that has alliances with India, as a result of what's happening now, could be a secular democratic Iran, Gulf states, Somaliland. We're seeing Cyprus, Greece, as Britain is showing itself to be completely useless and impotent with actual, former colonies like Cyprus. Israel is a much more powerful and clear and close ally to Cyprus and Greece. So we're actually seeing the birth of many more alliances, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for Israel to also prepare for a world where it's engaged in a broader web of alliances, always with the United States, but also to prepare for situations where you might have other voices in the United States, and to prepare for that as well.
To hedge their bets. I would love, if we could, to do a lightning round. I know a lot of people look to you to figure out how do you answer the hardest accusations that are made. So I'm going to tell you the top accusations, and I'm wondering if we can get your hot take. So the number one thing that I'm hearing is Israel forced America into this war.
So as I said, if anyone forced America into this war, it's the Iranian people themselves. They created the opportunity, they created the possibility that the United States can finally achieve the American goal of taking Iran out of the Chinese orbit into the Western orbit, and to do it in a way that will not require boots on the ground. So this is here to the courageous Iranian people.
This is an illegal and unjustified war.
It is absolutely legal. To that, I know you had Natasha Hausdorff with you.
That's a good answer. See the previous episode with
The
Natasha.
previous episode with Natasha on all legality issues.
Good answer. Trump is dragging America into a forever war.
The end game is a free, democratic, secular Iran that is part of the Western orbit. And again, the benefit of that is so massive that it is absolutely worth it, both in terms of securing American dominance in AI, in kind of hedging into China, and in really taking that central element out of the axis. This will be a foreign policy achievement on par with bringing down the Soviet Union. It's worth the effort.
And the last one I hear is, but they were negotiating. Negotiations were underway. Diplomacy was working.
Negotiations were underway. Diplomacy was not working. That's the correct description.
That is actually
true. Negotiations were always underway. This was known to be the Islamic Republic's go-to mode of operation to always buy time, especially to buy time with a democratic country where you can essentially out-negotiate presidents merely by playing for time. And President Trump, I think, called out that tactic as one that he's not going to fall for. And negotiations were not working because there was simply no world in which American demands were going to meet what the Islamic Republic was willing to do.
Good answer. Before we wrap, this is my last question to you. If the battlefield war ends in Israel's favor, as it appears it's going very well militarily, but this narrative war in the West continues to move against Israel, and obviously that has real repercussions for Jewish communities. We just saw in these past few days in Toronto, synagogues are being shot at. What is it that Israel and its friends around the world should be doing to counter the narratives and prepare for the next day?
The short answer is to understand that this is war and that Israel has to invest in it, prepare for it with Jewish people and allies around the world, as it does when it actually prepares for wars. And we're seeing now what Israel, especially the Air Force and the intelligence services, are like when they actually prepare for something, even when it's something ambitious. When they prepare, it is something remarkable. And I think for me, the biggest problem with the narrative war has been that we did not identify it as war. We did not identify it as an arena. And as a result, we never really put kind of both our minds and resources to that arena in the way that it should be. I think some people are beginning to understand it, not enough. I think this has to be an absolute priority. We also have some benefits with the possibility of a Qatar being deeply weakened as a result of the developments. They're a key element in the narrative war. Maybe they're also responsible for the Beltway panic. So we should make sure to take advantage of that, take advantage of, again, an Islamic Republic being removed from the narrative war in order to really fight this war in this arena as it should be.
Einat, I love having you on the show. Come back soon, please.
Always. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.